Hello and welcome to After Scientology, Straight Up and Vertical, the weekly show where Tony Ortega and I get together and we talk about what's been going on in the world of Scientology as reported on Tony's Substack in the last week. Hey, Tony, welcome back.
Hey, Chris, great to be here.
Yeah, 4th of July. Did you have a good time?
Oh, yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. I did too. We had a really nice time. Very loud. Is it loud where you are? It's very loud here.
Where I'm currently living, not too bad. I have lived in some neighborhoods where you feel like you're in the middle of a war all night, but this is a pretty quiet suburb, so it was fine.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, we were in the war zone until about 2 a.m. All right. So interesting stuff this week. And we're going to start with a little bit of history. There was a very interesting article, and I always love diving into these things, having to do with disconnection, Scientology's policy of shunning or basically breaking up families and friendships. And there was some history brought up. Somebody found some things. What was this about?
Yeah, so I've got this helper that dives into these obscure newspaper archives and finds stuff that, people probably haven't seen in a long time. And in this particular batch, he was looking at early mentions of fair game, early mentions of disconnection. And what I thought was really interesting was the three examples that I posted were all before Snow White. So, I mean, after Snow White and the FBI raid in 1977, there was a release of documents in 1979. And that's when the world really got to see all these crazy internal policies of Scientology and retaliation schemes and covert operations. But actually, a lot of that was spelled out in these stories from a decade earlier.
Yeah.
In particular, in England, a couple of really interesting stories showing that they were showing Hubbard's policies about fair game. One of them was kind of interesting. I hadn't heard of this before. There was a lawsuit in like 1970, 1969, something like that, where Scientology had sued a guy. Now, clearly, I think at the time they must have thought this was some clever way to retaliate against a guy who had been declared, but they sued him literally for not returning his outfit, his blazer, after he had been in the Sea Org or something. And it just completely backfired on them because then, of course, Scientology was in court. They had to answer questions about their policies. And it was just really bad for them in this, article. So I just thought that was remarkable, Chris, because it shows that courts and governments have no excuse, that this stuff has been laid out since the mid 60s, all these horrendous policies that Hubbard came up with for control, for coercion, for retaliation, for following people and intimidating people. All of that has just been spelled out. One of the articles that was really fun was a credulous reporter just reporting straight David Gaiman announcing that they were no longer, Scientology was no longer going to practice disconnection. They were no longer going to write down what people said in confessional sessions, and they were no longer going to have security checks. And this was in like 1969. David Gaiman was saying these things. At that point, David Gaiman was probably the most well-known Scientologist in all the United Kingdom. He was their spokesman there. Yes, he's the father of Neil Gaiman, who we'll talk about later in the show. But here, David Gaiman is telling these things to this reporter, and the reporter is just apparently buying it. That Scientology had gone through this rough period, but now we're no longer doing these things. And of course, they're doing them today. I mean, they never stopped for a minute to do any one of those two things: disconnection, writing down what's said in confessionals, and security checks. So I just thought it was amazing that Scientology was aware in the late 60s that those things made them look bad, so they better lie about it and say they're no longer doing it. So I don't know. I just thought this was a great collection of stories that showed that really the word was out by the late 60s. The really horrendous practices of this controlling organization. But, Chris, even today, we see judges, courts giving Scientology the benefit of the doubt and acting like they're a legitimate organization. And I just don't understand, how many times does this have to be proven over and over and over again in courts all around the world that this organization deals in nothing but bad faith and is following policies that dictate that they try to destroy families and destroy lives?
Right. That's right. I mean, it's literally historical record. And now, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't this the time period when Hubbard himself issued cancellation of fair game that they love talking about?
Right. So there were a couple of inquiries in Australia and New Zealand around that time, 65, 66, something like in that. And at some point, they realized that these policies looked really bad, particularly fair game. So fair game had been actually written down by Hubbard in 66 or 67. I'm sorry, I don't have all the dates right at my fingertips, but
Mm-hmm.
um, soon after that, and Gaiman even says something about it in that article, like, we realized that people didn't understand what we meant by fair game, that phrase didn't go over well.
Yeah.
So what Hubbard did was he literally issued a policy that says we are no longer going to call it fair game, but otherwise the policy's in place. So you can still lie, trick, sue, destroy Scientology, enemies utterly, and the Scientologists will pay no penalty
Yep.
for doing those things. Just don't call it fair game. And to this day, attorneys will cite that in court papers and say, "Judge, this fair game thing was canceled back in 1968." And it's just like, come on. These courts have got to know that they're just, trying to pull the wool over the eyes of the court, that the practice of fair game has never stopped. They just stopped calling it that for a few weeks, probably. I mean, of course, it's called fair game in Scientology. They use that all the time. So
Exactly.
that's what that reference is to, and you could see Gaiman actually refer to it into that story where he literally says people didn't understand what we meant by that, so we're not going to use that anymore.
Exactly. Total PR spin. Total PR spin. And Gaiman was their PR guy in the UK. That was his job, and he was really good at it. He was the Tommy Davis of his time, you could say. For those of you who remember Tommy Davis, he's been gone for a while now too. They haven't replaced him. They never replaced him. It's just been nonsense. But no, this is real, that they just cancel the names and the language and whatnot. This was 67, 68, by the way, and this was the time period when the Sea Org first came into existence. And those are not coincidences.
There is a great history to all of that. Steve Kinane did a great job in his book Fair Game. But let's remember, the Manual of Justice goes back to like 55 or something.
True.
I mean, Hubbard,
True.
If you want to go back to the beginning, it's just that Hubbard was paranoid. And, I've tried to explain to people, he came out saying it was a science. Dianetics, the modern science of mental health. The nature of science is that if one person discovers a principle, another person should be able to discover the same thing, because it doesn't belong to one person. That's not how science works. And so early on, his followers were like, "Hey, Ron, thanks for discovering these things. Now I'm going to take this discovery and go do something else with it." And that drove him nuts. He wanted to control this thing. And so that's why by the mid 50s, he starts writing the Manual of Justice, and he starts, actually describing these draconian rules for how to keep control. And he was inspired by the splinter groups. It drove him crazy that there were other people using his work in different ways. So that's where that starts. But then, as Steve Kinane really did a great job explaining in his book Fair Game, it got ramped up to another level when they ran into problems with Australia. There was one particular customer, and I'm not going to have his name at the tip of my tongue right now, but you can look it up in Steve's book. There was one particular guy that didn't like the way he got ripped off with Dianetics in Australia in like 1959 or 60 or something. And he had complained. And Kinane makes the great observation: if Ron had just gone to him and said, "Hey, I'm sorry it didn't work for you. Here's some of your money back." But no, it's like, screw that guy. And so that guy had connections in the government. And it was this one person really raising a stink that motivated the government down there to take a hard look at Scientology. Once they started doing that, that's when Hubbard really reacted in paranoid ways and started amping up, as you say, in 67, 66, in that era, really starts ramping up the intelligence operations, the totalitarianism. It was a direct result to the Australian government lifting the lid on this thing. So there's just a wonderful, I highly recommend Steve's book because it shows you how a lot of what we have with Scientology today goes back to how badly Hubbard screwed things up in Australia.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. Oh, you're going to investigate me? I'm going to investigate you. A cult leader 101, man. Okay, cool. That was good. That's good stuff. That was a good story. You guys should check that out. Now, also this last week, and I think we talked about this last week, but there was this new free emotion check. What is this now?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, Scientology has been very successful over many years, recruiting new people with some gimmicks, with some parlor tricks, one of which is the personality test. Pete Griffiths has talked about how when he wanted to get a mission going, all he had to do was put an ad in the paper. This is back in the 70s or early 80s. Put an ad in the paper and say, "Hey, are you curious about yourself? Take a personality test." And the responses would pour in. I mean, Scientology really had a big hit with that whole idea. People are curious about themselves. They want to take a test that tells them who they are. So the personality test was the first real big hit as far as bringing in the public at that time. Then they later developed this thing called a stress test where they took the e-meter and they pinch you and it makes the needle move and it's a little parlor trick. And so that became the big thing to get people. When you set up a table, you put up a sign saying, "Take a free stress test." That would bring people in because they were, everybody's stressed. You'd love to have it confirmed. And these people seem friendly and they want to, so the kind of two-pronged approach for decades has been the personality test and the stress test.
Yep.
So one of the things I do is I keep an eye on Scientology's press releases. They put one out almost every day. And they're usually just not worth paying attention to. But I was looking at one recently that talked about how they had set up a booth at some women's expo in Los Angeles. Okay. And then the press release was blah, 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 boring and whatever. But they had a photo of their booth at this expo. And where you would normally see free stress test, I noticed in 4 or 5 different places, free emotion test. Now, some people might say, "Tony, what's the big deal? It's a big difference." No, this is Scientology. It's a big deal if they change that wording, right?
Right.
So, I mean, the first thing I did was call up Claire Headley. And I said, "Might this be David Miscavige trying a new approach? Is this important?" And she said, "Absolutely, 100%. Now, other people have pointed out to me, maybe it was them tailoring things for a women's expo. Maybe it's a pilot project. I don't know, but I just thought that was really interesting, especially coming out of the pandemic. They've struggled. The recruiting's harder than ever. I can see Dave trying out a new thing, and free emotion test just really seems like the kind of thing that they would test. Now, from your experience,
Yeah.
can you take a guess how would the free emotion test work?
Oh, I'm thinking it's probably along the same gimmick lines as the stress test. They had e-meters set up. They had the same chair set up, with the books and everything. It's a gimmick to get the books sold. That's the product, is the book being sold. And so the meter is a device that people don't understand. And it has this little needle that moves around on it. And when you put a person on the cans, they can go, "Oh, look at that." And they go, "Ooh, see, this is you." And they're like, "Oh, really? Yeah, this." And look at this dial with these numbers. That's your emotions on this tone scale. See, ooh, it also looks so scientific. This isn't religion. No, this is science, baby. Right? That's how they sell it. So pretty sure that's what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. We're going to keep an eye out, see if that show keeps showing up. Maybe it was a one-off. Maybe it's sort of the new approach. But it's always fun. It's always fun to keep tabs on Scientology's latest little, schemes.
Absolutely, especially considering how slow they are to adopt and change.
Yeah.
That the stress test has been around since at least the 80s that I know of, and probably goes back to the 70s, but certainly the 80s. It's 2024. Maybe it's time for a new, tagline, right? Scientology. All right. Now, this was another kind of interesting story out of Canada. We had a check in from Phil and Willie.
Yeah. I kind of let some of my contributors know that hey, it's holidays. I'd kind of like to spend some time with the family. If you got something, let me know. And Phil was good enough to send me a report that he and Willie had gone by the Winnipeg org and the site of the future Winnipeg ideal org. And this is fun because David Miscavige, leader of Scientology, he's had lots of buildings purchased in various cities for future ideal orgs, and then they just sit there for years. And I didn't even know that Winnipeg was one of them. I mean, you never hear anything about Winnipeg,
Mm-mm.
but they apparently have bought a really large, very nice, but decrepit old building that's just sitting there rotting, of course, because as we've seen in so many other cities, that's what they do. Like in Chicago, for example, that building was just sitting there and it was racking up violations, and the city was getting angry that Scientology wasn't doing anything. And then all of a sudden, they spent millions of dollars, fixed it all up and opened it, and it's their newest ideal org in Chicago. That's what happens. Dave Miscavige does that on his schedule, nobody else's.
That's right.
So uh, Phil and Willie went by to take a look at this thing, and they were greeted by a very familiar kind of OSA type of thing where a guy came out with a camera and was filming them. And I'm hearing from people that they love the fact that Phil was like, "Hey, do you want to know my name?" He wanted them to know who it was checking up on them
Yeah.
on their ideal org. But I don't know. I thought it was great because it not only showed how they operate the way they always operate, but I haven't seen Winnipeg on a list of any of these ideal orgs. Chris, how many years is it going to be before that one's ready?
Right. It strikes me as the Albuquerque of Canada, right? Like just one of these, like there's 3 staff, and one of them's been there for 30 years. It's like one of those kind of places.
And the photo that Phil took of this building they've purchased, it's massive.
Huge.
And he was saying, look, they're not going to have enough staff for the first floor, let alone the other 5 or whatever.
Enough staff for the reception area, right?
It's
I mean,
crazy.
it's nuts. It really is. They do have an oversized view of themselves. There's no question about that. And I kind of got this funny a picture in my head just now of this wonderful building, but as you said, decrepit. By the time they open it, it's going to be one of those. What does the world look like after, with no people after 100 years? Right? There's all these vines and animals and shrubbery. That's the ideal org up there. It's not going. They're not doing anything. So, yeah, Winnipeg. Scientology taking Winnipeg by storm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And and then and it is always fun to hear from Phil and Willie. Actually, they're good people. Now we had another update this week, and this is always a fun one. Elrod Hubbard 2.0. What happened this week?
Yeah, I just can't help myself. I enjoy this story. There are people who are independent Scientologists. They've left the Church of Scientology, but they're still into the subject. They still like Hubbard and his technology. And I think it's a very small group. Inside of that small group, there's an even smaller group that thinks that Elrod Hubbard has returned in the form of this guy named Justin Craig, who legally changed his name to Lafayette Ronald Hubbard, LRH. And he's an ex-con from California who got involved in the indie movement up in in the Seattle area, and now is sitting in a jail in Tennessee, awaiting trial on some very serious charges. And so I just sort of keep an eye on him because even though he's been sitting in jail for almost 3 years on this current set of charges, he's still updating his followers at a Facebook group, and they're still sending him money. And we finally we got detailed documents on the charges he's actually facing and published those a few weeks ago. And I think it shocked some people to see how bad it was. And it might have shocked some of his followers. At that point, he put out messages to his followers that he was thinking of giving up the whole thing, but then said they overwhelmingly, reacted like, no, you got to keep going. And so he says he has more certainty than ever that he is the reincarnated Elrod Hubbard. And then this latest dispatch that I published this week was an interesting message he sent to his followers about big new breakthroughs he's been making at the OT level. And I just thought it was great. I actually heard from a few people, Chris, who said once they saw this, they're like, actually, he's pretty good at writing like Elrod Hubbard.
Yeah, he is.
Which was funny, and I made the point. I can see how for his small number of followers, what might be exciting to them, for people who consider themselves Scientologists, the scripture is set. I mean, Elrod Hubbard's gone. Nobody else can add to it. There's not going to be any new revelations. You're just studying the same old, standard Scientology, KSW. Whereas if you're an Asperianist, someone who follows LRH 2.0, he's coming out with new tech all the time. And that's kind of exciting, right? So right. I wanted people to see that. And then the other thing was I did hear from one of his followers, who's somebody that used to come around the bunker once in a while. And I had asked him, can you just explain to us why you think this is really LRH? And so he actually cited some passages from Hymn of Asia, which Hubbard wrote in the 50s and published in 1973. And so I thought it'd be fun to put those passages out and see if people saw anything in. Did you see anything in there that convinces you that this is the return to Elrod Hubbard?
I mean, there were a couple that were right there. I was almost convinced, but I was like, I don't know. No, of course not. Hymn of Asia is ridiculous. Am I Matea? This I'm reincarnated Buddha prophecy that doesn't even exist. I mean, Hubbard's fantasy world just really did not have any bounds. Yeah. And of course, these guys would want that. This is confirmation bias 101, right? That's the thing. It's like you need it to be true. And these guys really need it to be true. Because this is how they get along in life, and more power to them, I guess. But man, this guy's a convicted, he's in jail. I mean, literally.
Yeah.
So, no accounting for taste, I guess. But it is, I have to say too, I am fascinated by this because it's very rare that you get such an in-depth, real-time look at something like this and how this guy plays these people. And that's really kind of sadly how I see what's going on. Yeah.
Well, he's got another court hearing on August 2nd. We'll see if he finally gets a trial date. This follower of his was telling me that he thinks it's a conspiracy, that he hasn't had a trial, and that it's injustice. But the people at the court had told me that it was his own attorney that was asking for the delays. And I kind of understand it, because these are very serious charges over a number of years. It's going to be a complex trial. They're going to have a number of witnesses. And it's not looking great for him. So I don't know why they'd want to rush into trial at this point, because, anyway, so that was my understanding, was that it was his own attorney that was asking for these delays. But we'll see. August 2nd, maybe he'll get a trial date.
Yes, indeed. I'm reminded right now of a Hubbard lecture where he talked about a guy in jail who didn't think he was in jail. He was like, "Do you know nobody who's in jail really thinks they're in jail?" And you process this man, and suddenly you'll be auditing him, and suddenly he will look at you and look around the room. Iron bars. I believe I'm in jail, and I of course I can't help but yeah, Ron, you are. Anyway, sorry. All right, finally we have what I was surprised. This really kind of came out of nowhere for me. This update you had this week on Neil Gaiman and recent accusations.
Yeah, I've written about Neil quite a bit over quite a few years. going back to, I was at a party at Patty Moyer's house back in 2011 or something,
Wow.
2012, and Paulette Cooper was there, and she and Patty were kind of going through some old documents that Patty had, and I'll never forget Paulette bringing me this and saying, "Tony, look what we just found," and it was this little pamphlet, only 7 or 8 pages, that was a message to the members of Parliament, printed up by the Church of Scientology in like 1969 or something, right in the middle of that period where Parliament was really cracking down on Scientology. And so Scientology was trying to influence the members of Parliament. And it contained this transcript of a BBC interview with a 7-year-old boy who was a Scientologist. And the reason why Scientology wanted Parliament to see this was because this 7-year-old boy was obviously so talented and had benefited from being raised a Scientologist. And it was to try to show people, look, Scientology is a very positive thing. Look at this wonderful boy who's grown up in the church. Well, that 7-year-old boy was Neil Gaiman, famous, internationally famous fantasy SF author, son of David Gaiman, who at that time was the most famous Scientologist in the United Kingdom. And so that just, I thought that was really interesting that David Gaiman used this BBC interview of his son kind of as propaganda on Parliament. And at that time, I remember saying, writing the Village Voice, "Hey BBC, you got to find this tape for us." And eventually they did. They did track down that interview,
Wow.
and I've heard some of it. They played some of it. Um, and then I wrote about Neil again when he wrote this book called The Ocean at the End of the Lane, which came out around 2013, I think. And it was real interesting because he had just been married to Amanda Palmer for a short time, the musician. And he explained this in an interview that she had kind of been curious about his Scientology past, and so he thought about it. And a key thing that happened to him when he was about that age, 6 or 7 years old, is his father David ran a boarding house for Scientology students. And one morning, one of their students from South Africa showed up dead in a car at the end of their lane. And so it became a big thing. And so Neil went back into his memory and his childhood and created this novel. Now it's a fantasy novel, and I wrote about how there's some things that seem a little bit like Scientology, but not really. But it was a very popular book. It's become a hit play in London. I
Mm.
assume it's going to be a movie at some point. And again, I think it was motivated by Amanda Palmer asking Neil about his Scientology background. And I have pointed out, listen, there are people out there that don't like Neil Gaiman and assumed he was still involved with Scientology. And I said, look, I take it at face value what he says, that he left in the like mid 80s. But he doesn't criticize Scientology because his dad died in 2009, but his mom Sheila is still an ardent Scientology donor. His two sisters, he's got one in the Sea Org, and the other one, Lizzie Calcioli, her son Ale, was in the first sanctioned Scientology wedding in English history. So
Right.
that's how into it everybody around him is. And so I haven't really blamed Neil for not saying anything about it. Try to cut him a break. Okay. Well, back in March, a couple of journalists contacted me. They wanted to talk to me about Neil's background, and they let me in on the idea that a couple of women had come forward with sexual assault allegations against Neil. I told them I didn't know anything about that. They said, no, that's fine. We just want to ask you about the whole Scientology thing. So we talked, they wanted to ask about, for example, at one point, his dad, David Gaiman, was declared, and you can read his declare online, and it accuses him of sexual improprieties. And but I know that David was back in good graces later. So what I said to them was, look, be cautious, because just because Scientology in a declare says that somebody did all these awful things doesn't mean you should believe Scientology. They'll say anything
Right.
about anybody in a declare. So that's the kind of thing where they had run into these things. They wanted to get my thoughts on that. And in general, Chris, what I told them was, look, they told me a little bit about the allegations against him. I'm not too much, but obviously they were wondering if some of these things that he's accused of by these women, could he have picked them up from Scientology? And I said, look, I think you should be careful about that. He's been out since the mid '80s.
Yeah.
These are allegations that came up in around the year 2010 and then 2022. Look, if the guy's a creep, he may just be a creep, and it has nothing to do with Scientology. I'd be cautious about that. So they thanked me, and then the podcast came out on July 3rd, 4-part series. You can hear a little bit of me in episode 3. It's a really tricky story to tell, Chris, because these two women admit they were in consensual relationships with Neil Gaiman, but that some non-consensual things happened, and they're very unhappy. The woman, the most recent one, is a woman named they're calling Scarlett in New Zealand. These incidents happened in 2022, and she was hired by Amanda to be their nanny. And on the very first day, she went to the house when it was just her and Neil. I guess the kid was somewhere else that day. He drew her a bath. She got into the bath, and then he walked in naked. Day one of her day as a nanny, right? And he's not denying that. They got extensive responses from Neil Gaiman on all these allegations. What he's saying is these were both consensual relationships. You should listen to the podcast. They handle a very sensitive subject because and this, I was having flashbacks to the Danny Masterson case, because if you remember the Danny Masterson case, the defense wanted to say that Jane Doe 2, Jane Doe 1 to a certain extent, that after these incidents, these horrific incidents they described with Danny Masterson, there were still these friendly exchanges. There were some messages. There were, and so the prosecutors brought in a expert to say, look, women react in different ways, especially if it's somebody they know.
That's right.
And so I was having flashbacks to that, because in this case, there seems to be some really interesting evidence. There's lots of WhatsApp messages. There's friends that they were talking to contemporaneously, but there's also messages from these women saying, "Oh, Neil, I'm so glad to see you. Last night was great." And that makes it really complicated, makes it very hard to prosecute something like that. So I thought they did a very good job of handling that. I thought they were as sensitive as they could be to that. They gave Neil Gaiman extensive time. He apparently sent them some written things, and they were reading it themselves. I thought they did a very responsible job with that. Scientology's in it a little bit, and I was happy to supply that part of it. I don't know what's going to happen. I know Amanda Palmer ends up looking pretty bad, and I don't know what's going to happen for the two of them. But it is interesting, and I don't know. It's shocking. I'm seeing on social media just a ton of people just trying to grapple with the idea that this author that they admired so much is being accused of these things. But I would recommend you listen to the podcast. I thought they did a very good job handling this very sensitive material.
Cool. Well, that is good. And it is a nuanced, difficult topic. And especially when you're dealing with power disparities with a world famous author, creator. Neil Gaiman is not nobody. That man is definitely somebody. And sometimes people in that position just not super aware of the disparities and do things thinking it's consensual, and it's not. And so I don't have an opinion on it one way or the other, because I don't have the information. I just am shocked at the situation at all. But I will put forward from my experience, including some backstory with the Gaimans myself, from Twin Cities of all places. He has a house in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And the woman who was the ED, the executive director of one of the Twin Cities churches, was his ex-wife, Mary. Right. And so I interacted with her quite a bit and learned a little bit about the Gaimans from that. And there was no question whatsoever. He was not on lines, not a Scientologist anymore. Right. That just wasn't a thing. So I can say that much, that I can confirm. If he's a Scientologist, it is covert to covert to covert that his ex-wife doesn't even know. So, so no. guess we're going to see where this goes.
Yeah.
And we'll let the courts do it.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff. So, okay, Tony, now, as I'm wont to do at this time, what are we thinking about this coming up week?
Oh boy. I got some fun stuff. I also have a couple of court cases I'm looking at. I think I'm finally going to have an update in Leah's lawsuit. I hope this week. I've been waiting for some information to come in.
Cool.
It's July, man. Some stuff slows down a bit, but you can see even on the July 4th week, we had some fun stuff.
Big time. Big time. All right. Well, keep tuned in then, folks. In fact, you can see the address to Tony's Substack right there on the screen. Look it up, subscribe to it, get your daily notifications, and then check in with us for the weekly summaries. We've always got some interesting bits to throw in on top of these. And on that happy note, I will see you guys next week. Tony, see you next week. Bye-bye.